Hello and welcome to INSPIRE's Unplugged Dialogue series. INSPIRE is a Horizon Europe project that started in October 2022 and will finish at the end of September 2026. The aim of the INSPIRE is to create the European Centre of Excellence on inclusive gender equality in research and innovation. INSPIRE really has two main aims. Firstly, to build up the evidence base on how to integrate intersectional perspective into gender equality plans, and also to provide practical support to 12 communities of practice of approximately 90 organizations working together to design, implement, and evaluate an inclusive change process. And now, I would like to welcome today's guest, Elena Phalet. For those unfamiliar with her work, let me introduce her briefly. Elena is working in monitoring and evaluation of research and innovation section at the Belgian Federal Science Policy Office. She works as a data analyst and policy advisor focusing on research and development in the not-for-profit sectors. She has been a member of the steering committee for the last 3 she figures. She is a member of the ERA Action 5 subgroup on gender equality and chairs a Belgian interfederal consultation group on gender issues. Her interest in gender issues dates back to her first year at university, where a professor in metaphysics actually said that the female brain was unequipped for the level of abstraction that philosophy requires. Once again, welcome, Elena. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
You have lots of experiences in data monitoring, so let me start with the first question. According to your experiences, how can data monitoring support the development and implementation of gender equality plans in research performing organizations?
Well, data monitoring can show you where there are potential problems, so where you need to focus your efforts when you implement a JEP. And data monitoring also shows you which indicators could be relevant to include in your gender equality plan. I could give you 2 examples. So, as you said, thank you for the introduction. I work for the Belgian Federal Science Policy Department, which has a JEP, and we have part of our department is 10 large research performing organizations, which also all 10 of them have JEPs. And when you look at data for all personnel for the entire department, which is about 2,500 people, you have 54% of employees who are men and 46% who are women, more or less. When I talk about gender balance here with this personnel data, I'm actually talking about biological data, so just the binary man-woman division, because we have no data yet, unfortunately, about gender identities. And our data is based on national registry numbers. So this is unfortunately still just a biological distinction. So when you look at the organizational level, this is difficult. So when you look at all the personnel, you have this 54% versus 46% division between men and women. But when you look at an organizational level, there's this one RPO, which stands out because it has a completely different men-woman ratio. It has 75% men and only 25% women. So this shows you that there could be a real problem in this research performing organization. It could be, for example, that there are as many women as men applying for positions, but that they don't get through the selection process. And then you can go look at these selection processes and possible biases in them. And you can design specific actions for your JEP. For example, include unconscious bias training or start using gender priming. Another possibility is, of course, that women do not even apply or not in the same numbers as men. And then you could go look at the job postings. Where do we post them? And how are they phrased? Because we know this is important. When you use words like competitive and leader, these are masculine coded, and they will tend to reduce the number of women applying. While when you use words like responsible and conscientious, this will attract more women and men too. We also know that if you stress in a job posting innate qualities such as talent or intelligence or genius even, that tends to attract more men than women. And of course, both can be true. It's possible that less women apply and even fewer women get through the selection process. I have another lovely example which I bumped into last week. Can I give you that too?
Yeah, please go on.
So the first one shows you that a very simple indicator, like just a general overview of men and women employees, is worth monitoring and can give you ideas for other indicators, which can also be relevant, such as number of applicants to the organizations by sex. And another example of how a general indicator can suggest other relevant indicators and concrete actions is the following. So last week I was making this very simple graphic of men and women researchers. So not all personnel, but focused on researchers in all 10 RPOs. There are about 1,000 persons employed. And the ratio women-men is about 45% women, 55% men. And in headcounts, that's about 90 more persons who are men. And I was looking at the aggregated numbers for all organizations and seeing, as expected, slightly more men researchers than women. But then I looked at the levels. We have 4 levels for scientific personnel. Mostly you get hired in level 1 or 2 if you have a PhD, and then you can be promoted to 3 and 4. And when you look at the lowest grade, so level 1, and only at the lowest grade, there are more women researchers than men. All the other grades, more men. This lowest grade, more women. And then if you combine this with age within this level, you see that by the time researchers are between 40 and 50 years old, women make up 2/3 of all researchers in this lowest pay grade. And the men disappear from this lowest level at a much higher rate than the women. So I went to look for possible explanations, and one of them is that you can only get promoted to a higher level if you're hired with a statutory contract and not a temporary one. And if you look at our numbers, only 1 in 4 women researchers have a statutory contract, and 1 in 3 men do. So this type of contract has direct financial consequences for example, your salary during maternity leave, remuneration during sick leave, your pension, but it impacts also directly your career opportunities. And a second thing is that to be promoted to level 2, 3, or 4, the main criterion used is still publications and citations, which again, both are known to disadvantage women researchers. There's a lovely article called I Forgot That You Existed, which is also a Taylor Swift song. And it looks at this gender gap in citation. And the authors found that if you ask men researchers to name 5 experts, they will give you mostly 5 names of men. While if you ask women, they will have a mix of men and women. But the men researchers know women experts because the name recognition is there. If you give them names, they will say, oh yes, I know about her work. But they need more time to think of the women researchers themselves. So that's one explanation for the gender gap in citations. And it might also explain why it remains, at least for us in Belgium, so difficult to have really gender balanced research teams.
Yeah, these are very nice examples.
Nice, right? This is all true.
Yeah. So, given your expertise, what advantages can data monitoring bring to gender equality in academia and research?
So data monitoring is still the easiest way, I think, to show the effects of existing biases in organizations, because they can very clearly show you horizontal and vertical segregation. They also clearly illustrate a leaky pipeline, how women disappear from research careers at a much higher rate than men. And being able to show these impacts with graphics and numbers illustrates the structural nature of these problems. It's not just one woman who doesn't get promoted. It's a structural problem for all women and other minorities, of course. And structural problems mean you need to look for structural solutions as well. And this can be especially useful when gender equality efforts in an organization are performative, which is often the case, in the sense that people want to be seen to be doing something, but they lose interest when gender equality is not at the forefront of the political agenda, or when they think that we have now spent enough time on this. The data can show you that a continued effort is needed and that it's in the interest of the organization itself and of the excellence of its research. And focusing on the situation in research and academia, aside from the personnel issues we've already discussed, two other issues are very important concerning inclusive gender equality, and they need to be monitored. And these are gender in research contents and diversity in research teams. My department also runs a research program and funds them. And the form you have to fill in to submit a proposal includes questions about both these issues. For the inclusion of gender in research content, we ask, not that every project has a gender studies expert involved, but just that researchers ask themselves while designing the research, formulating the questions, deciding on the method, is there a gender dimension relevant here? Does gender impact our outcomes or our method or both? And have we taken this into account? Because there are many examples where this went wrong and sometimes with catastrophic results, as you can, for example, find in the book Invisible Women by Carolina Criado Perez, which is excellent and gives very concrete examples. Concerning the gender balance in research team, this is important because we know research has shown that it increases creativity, it increases effective problem solving, it increases the societal impact of the research, and also it increases the usefulness of personal expertise of each member individually. And because we like to track at Belspo how research proposals treat both these issues and if this changes over time or if we need to take action, we've looked at all the proposals for one of our programs. It was about 150 ones, I think. And we grouped them into 4 different recurring attitudes in the answer to the question about gender balance in research teams. And we've summarized these attitudes in 4 profiles, which allows us to track over time these attitudes. Shall I give you the profiles or is that too detailed?
Yeah, sure. You can give the profiles.
So first you had the defensive profile, which refers to a lack of qualified women researchers in a particular field of science, in the organization, at a preferred grade, etc. Then you had the this should do it profile, which just quotes existing relevant legislation and guidelines or official texts, sometimes even on an EU level, not even inside of the organization. Some people also just say we have a job, so everything should be fine. Then there's the commit to commit profile, which focuses on the project in question and says we know it's very important to have a diverse research team, but it actually remains limited to general statements of intent, for example, vague promises to aim at or to strongly encourage diversity and equal opportunities, but not much in the way of practical commitments. And then you have the actually committed profile, which actually gives you tangible initiatives and objectives to arrive at a research team that is as diverse as possible. For example, we had one promising to pay specific attention to equal visibility for all project participants, as, for example, a first author or a speaker at conferences, which seems a really good idea. So because most of the proposals we saw remained stuck in profile 1 and 3 mostly, we are going to propose for the coming research program to make these gender equality questions more important in the evaluations, well, the answers to these questions. So we would like to, when 2 proposals are ranked the same after evaluation, that the answers to those 2 questions, are the defining factor to give priority to one. And we're hoping to see a change towards more instances of the 4th profile when we implement that.
Very well. According to your experiences, what are the biggest struggles and challenges for monitoring gender equality plans?
First challenge definitely is resources, time and workload. Not all organizations have dedicated personnel with the necessary expertise, and monitoring jobs falls still disproportionately on women and or persons who take this on top of their other tasks. A second challenge, I think, is still an implementation gap. So as you know, there's a lot of interesting work being done on creating, monitoring, evaluating jobs. There are, for example, guidelines for writing effective jobs from the European Institute for Gender Equality. We have excellent research projects such as Gender Action Plus, Mind the Jobs, etc. But if you're expected to write implement, monitor, and evaluate a JEP that is really focused on and adapted to your own specific needs in your national, regional, in your specific organizational context, sometimes the translation of these general guidelines remains difficult. So I'm using personally 2 resources I found very, very useful, which give very practical information on how to address gender equality issues. One is the website biasinterrupters.org, and the other is an online publication called It's Not That Grey, period. The last one is a publication online which helps you identify gender-based violence in all its forms and at different stages of escalation, with many examples and testimonies and ways to address the problem. And the Bias Interrupters website lists common mistakes and oversights and how you can rectify them, again, in very specific situations, such as performance evaluations, hiring, recruiting, family leave, remote working, meetings, etc., with advice such as, this sounds really logical, but it's still necessary to say this. Don't assume women, especially women with care duties, are not interested in promotions or in challenging projects. Ask them first if they would like to join the project or be promoted. A third issue is linked to this. That's the fact that a JEP that is too general is hard to implement. And the implementation is hard to monitor. So you need to define very specific indicators which are suited to your specific organization and situation and to what you need to know. And then you have to find the relevant data for these indicators, which give you the information you need. We had, for example, one of our organizations which recommended as an action in their JEP to have exit interviews with every researcher leaving the organization, which is indeed possibly a very useful instrument to follow up on the experience of all the researchers, specific issues women researchers face, and possible gender-based violence issues as well, which in turn you can use to define further indicators and data monitoring. And finally, the bias and sometimes the professional, personal, political priorities of the people in the organization working on the JEPs, or the people you need to provide data or to implement your JEP. There's still an authority gap. The people working on a JEP are mostly women, and sometimes I still have to put a lot of energy into explaining and framing and convincing people of even just the use of having a JEP and trying to implement it.
Yeah, I totally agree. In your view, what improvements does the European Commission need in order to have long-lasting data monitoring for gender equality in academia and research?
I think it's very important, especially in the present political climate, that the Commission keeps leading and presenting inclusive gender equality not only as a fundamental ethical principle, but also as a condition for excellent research, innovation, and sustainable competitiveness, because we're very focused on competitiveness now. Also, I think it's important that there are sufficient resources within the Commission to follow up on inclusive gender equality in R&D. At the moment, the gender sector within Unit 4, Democracy, Equality and Culture, which is within DG Research and Innovation, has only 3 mainly overworked employees left, and that is including the head of sector. A third thing I think is important is that the EU continues to fund research on inclusive gender issues within the Framework Programme for Research and Innovation, because the more insight we gain, the better our ideas will be, the better our policies will be, and the better the chances that we realize structural change. And lastly, I think it's very important that the She Figures continues. It's an important initiative. It will give us time series for indicators which are repeated. And we also, for each publication, we decide on newly relevant issues which we need to monitor. So it's important that resources keep going to that as well.
I'm also a huge fan of the She Figures. So, based on your experience, can you present some best practices for integrating data monitoring into gender equality plans to ensure they are effective and sustainable over time?
So a CHEP will list objectives and then specify actions to be taken to realize them, and then list indicators which will allow you to follow up on the actions and their impact. And for me, I think there's an interaction, an interplay even between the data collection and analysis on the one hand, and defining relevant indicators on the other hand. You collect data to try and describe an indicator, and looking at this data can give you ideas to fine-tune these indicators, or give you ideas for further or different indicators, which will allow you to even better follow up on the actions you're taking. Like in the example we gave in the beginning about our researchers at the different levels, just seeing that made me realize we have to track research careers within our research performing organizations, and we need gendered data on people applying for jobs at our organizations, and we need to track statutory contracts and temporary contracts also with gender data. So referring back to the example I gave in the beginning about the research personnel, it's important, seeing those data makes you realize it's not only important to track numbers of men and women researchers overall, but also in specific pay grades and combined with age group, also keeping track of temporary and statutory contracts and of research careers, and all this, of course, with gender data. So for me, the data monitoring does not end in a graphic or a table or a percentage. It actively contributes to better define relevant indicators and to identify where additional actions need to be taken for the gender equality plan.
Right. As you know, there is a shift in terminology from gender equality plans to inclusive gender equality plans. What do you think about inclusive gender equality plans, and how would you describe it? And what are the challenges to monitor inclusive gender equality plans?
So the word inclusive refers to an intersectional perspective, and it describes the ways in which gender identity intersects with other personal characteristics or identities, and how these intersections cause instances of compounded structural discrimination. For example, sexual orientation, ethnic origin, age, socioeconomic class. And these minoritized groups are listened to least, have least impact on discourse, they have less or no power, they are less seen. And this situation can be even worse for someone who belongs to several groups at the same time. We see this very clearly in gender-based violence statistics. If you belong to an intersection of different minority groups, you are more at risk to be a victim of gender-based violence, which remains a pervasive problem in research. We also see this specifically for research with the diversity innovation paradox in science. There was a very interesting article analyzing 1.2 million PhDs over the past 30 years, which clearly shows that research by minority groups is overall more innovative. But these researchers are less rewarded with publications, promotions, even just jobs and funding compared to traditional white male researchers. So inclusive CHEPs try to take these dimensions into account, which means you should collect data about them so you can show how these biases cause exponential inequalities, and to make people aware again of the systemic nature of these biases. This is a very important step towards inclusive gender equality, because by its very nature, bias is pervasive and can remain invisible to majority groups if they are not made aware of them explicitly and of the impact they have on a person, on their well-being, their career, their professional, personal productivity, and consequently for the whole research performing organization. However, these data are very personal and very sensitive to collect, and giving this information can feel threatening to minority groups. So if you try to collect data like this, necessary safeguards need to be in place. Like, for example, there should be a guarantee of anonymity with the respondent remaining anonymous to the data collector as well. With only aggregated numbers or percentages being published. You also have to be very careful on which platforms you keep the data. And you have to think carefully about which indicators are actually useful so as not to overwhelm people with too many very intrusive questions. And you have to think about how to phrase these questions in order to get responses that are informative and possible to answer. Sorry about that.
No problem. So, what advice would you give to stakeholders who want to get involved in data monitoring in gender equality initiatives?
My advice would be, please do, because every step is important. It can be really demotivating to see some institutions or countries which have these wonderful, elaborate, mandatory systems in place. But anything you can get done is a step forward and can turn out to be of practical help to minority groups in your organization to create fair policies to address bias in everyday situations. So any small step helps.
I totally agree. Please do data monitoring. Which brings us to our last question. How can policymakers use data monitoring to inform their decisions and create more equitable policies?
I think it's very important here that data are collected in scientific and responsible ways and that they are treated and analyzed by experts, and that any policy recommendations are made by these researchers on the basis of their expertise. Because as a very general rule, policymakers have a different skill set than researchers, and you need a scientific one at the basis of your policy design. There are guidelines and tips for researchers on how to write effective policy briefs, for example, from the European Research Agency. And policymakers should first listen to scientifically sound analysis of the situation and all its complexities, and to other kinds of experts who are active in the fields in question and have therefore valuable experience before policies are put into place. And once a policy is put in place, it needs to be monitored for effectiveness and also for possible unwanted side effects or for a lack of impact.
Thank you so much, Elena, for the all insightful answers you have provided.
Thank you.